So we just finished talking about the Gaonic period, and one of the communities that was most heavily influenced by the Gaonim of Baghdad were the Jews of North Africa. Let's take a few moments to look at the origins of that community and understand how they were shaped by the Muslim conquest, and we'll conclude this lecture with one of the high points of the history of the scholarship that emanated from North Africa. So when we speak about North Africa, there's actually a term that's used in the scholarly literature, the Maghreb, which means literally the West, and it's an Arabic term. The Hebrew would be Ma'arav, that encompasses these countries here in modern day terms. Basically, Libya, Algeria, Morocco in particular are the most significant for Jewish purposes. And as you can see, the population density is highest on the coast itself. As you move further south, you get to the Sahara Desert, much more forbidding, much less population growth there. But there are Jews who are living, for example, on the southern side of the Atlas mountain range in Morocco and so on. Let's have a look here at a satellite photograph so we can talk a little bit about the origins of these long-standing communities. Now, much of this is shrouded in legend. There is definitely, however, a significant Semitic influence in North Africa from the first millennium before the Common Era, like let's say 900 BCE. But it's not necessarily Jewish, it is Phoenician. You have Phoenicians are a maritime civilization that, of course, were involved in Israel as well, and they have settled many places along the coast. Their language is closely related to Hebrew, and so that was kind of like a cultural and linguistic entree to North Africa that was especially significant as we have more migration there. Now, one of their most famous cities is Carthage, which would be in Tunisia today. The legends of the earliest Semitic settlement suggest that some of the earliest populations to settle there after the Phoenicians were some of the early Canaanite peoples. Josephus suggests that some of Abraham's children who did not form, let's say, the Mosaic Israelite Jewish branch, that is Abraham's children by Keturah, his second wife. The Torah describes his children by Keturah as having been sent east with gifts. Obviously, they returned, bringing with them Asian food. But it's also possible, according to Josephus, to think of them traveling west. So they would have been descendants of Abraham. Augustine, in the 4th century, we spoke about him, he's one of the church fathers a while ago, he refers to the local term that people used for themselves in his region of Chenani, saying that this actually comes from Knaani, which means Canaanite, that some of the earliest peoples were those that may have been expelled in the conquest under Joshua. There's a legendary thought that the peoples of North Africa may have descended from the Girgashi people that are mentioned in the Torah as one of the 7 Canaanite nations that are expelled in the context of the Jewish conquest of the land of Israel. In terms of Jewish settlement per se, Joshua himself, his tomb is apparently venerated in Tlemcen, which is in Algeria. It's unlikely that Joshua actually moved to the west, but nevertheless, this is kind of like part of the lore of the region. But the fact that there were Hebrew speakers in the region, not Aramaic speakers, suggests that it is not at all impossible to imagine migration there from the 6th century BCE and onward. That is, after the destruction of Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar and the expulsion of Jews to Babylonia, it is in that Persian period that you begin to develop Aramaic as the lingua franca of Jews. Having Hebrew as the spoken language would suggest that, yeah, in fact, these peoples would have come quite a bit earlier. But at any rate, whatever you make of these various legendary possibilities, there's no question that we have strong populations there in the 1st and 2nd centuries, lots of documentation of boatloads of captive Jews after the First Roman-Jewish War being sent throughout the Mediterranean. You have the migration after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. We know of Jews, for example, in Kyrenaica, Kyrene, that actually had a revolt against the Romans in the year 117, the Kitos rebellion, which we spoke about a while ago. So there's no question there's lots of Jews living here around the turn of the millennium. There's some interesting archaeological discoveries, such as a mosaic that was originally thought to be of a church that was discovered in Tunisia, but looking at it a little bit more closely, you can see it says right there in the middle of the text, Sancta Synagoga. It says Holy Synagogue, and in the little medallions on either side of the text, there is the very classic Jewish representation of the menorah, which makes this a prime candidate, of course, for first century Jewish settlement in the region. The Muslim conquest in the 7th century is especially interesting because we have a lot more historical treatment of the discovery of Jewish tribes living in North Africa. The Muslim historian Ibn Khaldun says that they came across these Berber tribes. Now, the term Berber is acceptable in English, although it is originally a derogatory term that was applied by the Greeks to the indigenous peoples of North Africa. Lacking, respect for their local terminology, they referred to their language as being kind of like a gibberish. They would say bar, 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 and hence we get the term in English barbarian. But ultimately, the term was transvalued and it was used to refer to these peoples without necessarily having a negative connotation. Now, among these multiple tribes, several of them were actually practicing Judaism. And the Muslims were surprised to see, wow, significant Jewish populations among these peoples. The earlier Semitic context, the earlier migrations of Jews, no doubt had an impact on the local populations. The conversion to Judaism was especially pronounced among the nomadic forms of the Berber civilization, the so-called Boter branch, that were less sedentary and actually quite warlike, which is fascinating to see. In particular, you see there's a lot of legends regarding Queen Kahina of a tribe called Jirawa that is associated with Judaism. In fact, the term Jirawa may be related to the Hebrew term ger. Ger means convert, and although there are lots of questions surrounding Queen Kahina and trying to understand whether or not she was actually Jewish, if the Jirawa were actually Jewish at this time, but she is nevertheless a major part of 7th century history for her ferocious defense of her tribe from the Muslim invaders. She actually fell in battle herself, but it is significant in terms of describing the extent to which Judaism had penetrated the local populations. Now, just thinking about North Africa in terms of these kind of exotic warrior clans is a bit of a distortion of what else is going on in North Africa as well. There's actually a lot of scholarship developing, especially on the coast, as you have more and more scholars coming together in the welcoming environment of Islam to engage in religious studies. Perhaps the most famous is Rabbeinu Hananel ben Hushiel, who was an 11th century commentator who actually wrote the first full commentary on the Talmud. If you study Talmud today in the traditional printing, you will see Rabbeinu Hananel right on the side, the outside margin of every page of Talmud, which is prime real estate for commentaries. He actually wrote his commentary before Rashi, which gives you an indication of the antiquity of his work. Now, he may have been originally from Rome, and that just indicates how important the community of Qairouan, which is not the same as Cairo. Qairouan is located in Tunisia today, but that the community was strong enough to attract a scholar of his standing. Even more famous than Rabbeinu Hananel, it's impossible to talk about medieval North African Jewry without referring to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Yaakov Alfasi. Alfasi means the one from Fez. Fez is in Morocco, and he wrote a brilliant and very widely used Talmudic commentary that is still incredibly essential to studying the Talmud. Rabbi Alfasi's commentary is interesting in that, as we've discussed in previous lectures, the Talmud is a very unusual document in which there's a lot of discussion of halachic practice, how one should behave as a Jew, and a back and forth of debate looking at the ambiguities of the text and arguing different positions, and sometimes, but certainly not all the time, coming to a clear and resolved conclusion. But the Talmud also includes a tremendous amount of material which seems really quite tangential in nature, that goes off and talks about metaphysics or biographies or recipes or observations from the natural universe, all kinds of things which are kind of a miscellany that are attached with very, very thin connections to the previous material, I think it makes the Talmud absolutely fascinating to read. But the Alfasi said, wait a second, it's really important that we get to the bottom line, how we should behave here. So he went through the entire Talmud and he removed all of that other stuff called Agarata, which I find that much more appealing in many ways, but that's just me. He removed all that stuff. And he recorded the debate in the Talmud back and forth, inserting his commentary as necessary in the narrative, sometimes with clearer conclusions. And he made a much more strapped down, pragmatic, this is how the Talmud derives the final legislation that eventually became a major building block in the entire firmament of Jewish law. Hugely influential text that is usually printed at the back of every Talmudic tractate in traditional printings today. I should mention, before we leave this, that another author, about 500 years later, named Ibn Khabib, said, you know what? All that other stuff is so good. So whereas the Alfasi removed all of the Agarata and kept only the halacha, Ibn Khabib said, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to keep all of the Agarata in a separate book, which is published under the title Ein Yaakov. He and then later his son completed the work. And that was a widely studied text for many hundreds of years. It has somewhat faded in recent centuries, but hopefully it will get some renewed attention because it is an absolutely fascinating work. Okay, so that's a very quick look at the Jews of North Africa. I hope you enjoyed this brief video.